In the beginning, when you are trying to get clients, you may do a lot of work with prospective buyers. It is important to understand the standards that will apply to you as a buyer's broker. This includes specialized terminology, specialized duties owed the buyer, your client, and the owner, your customer, and an understanding of the contracts that impact your relationship with the buyer. Duties performed on behalf of the buyer. When you act as an agent for a buyer, your basic duties include finding the appropriate property for the buyer, negotiating an offer with the listing agent, resolve setbacks that come up in the process, recommend other professionals when needed. Let's look at examples of each of these. Locate the correct property. While you are interviewing clients, you want to know a range of requirements. Your list should include first picks, as well as what they are willing to accept within the constraints of their budget. With this information, you will be able to visit homes that are more likely to suit your buyers, which can save a lot of wasted time and energy. As an agent, your buyer will rely on your expertise in specific neighborhoods to help guide their decision. This should always be an honest assessment of the relative pros and cons of the area. For example, Marcia Clark wanted to find a home with a park nearby where she could take her young children. She had a limited budget and required 4 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms minimum for her growing family and work-at-home husband. You find a suitable home 2 blocks from a neighborhood park. The downside is that the house is close to the street and the existing office is right next to noisy traffic. How do you present the home to Marcia? Because you are a creative and inventive agent, you suggest another room for the office and use the existing one as a guest and storage room. You also present several other properties with their various pros and cons. Negotiate the offer. As the buyer's agent, you will advise your client on the reasonable price range of each property and make recommendations on offer prices. Ultimately, it is the buyer who determines the offer they are willing to make, and that is what you will present to the seller's agent. The negotiation is the process of going back and forth until a mutually acceptable offer is presented and accepted in writing. The buyer's agent draws up the offer and puts it before the seller. You will become very adept at negotiating deals and be able to honestly advise buyers of the advantages and pitfalls of various properties. For example, your client falls in love with the price of a dilapidated property that has structural issues and leaky pipes. You advise them that they are unlikely to recoup the money spent on repairs in the event that they resell the home. Your client hears what you have to say, then decides to buy the property anyway. Your responsibility is to put your own opinions aside and make an offer on the property. Recommend other professionals to facilitate the sale. As the buyer's agent, you are expected to make connections that make the sale go faster. If the buyer needs to pre-qualify, walk them through the process with the banks to obtain a letter of eligibility to obtain the necessary funds for the purchase. If your clients have not obtained financing yet, recommend them to reputable mortgage brokers that you have worked with previously and who have proven to be reliable. buyers should retain a real estate attorney to review the final deal. If your buyers plan to hire an attorney and ask for a recommendation, you must be able to provide competent recommendations. The same theme holds true for other professionals commonly involved in the purchase of real property. Some of the service providers you will want to keep in your phone include home inspectors, movers, and many more. For example, your clients are elderly and not computer savvy. They want to do some major renovations on the home you help them buy. You put them in touch with a project manager who can help them prepare a budget and manage the contractors. Your clients, after a successful remodel, recommend you to several buyers over the next several years. This is great for business, and you become known as a full-service agent who can always be counted on. All this from a recommendation that cost you nothing but a little time. This practice helps you in several ways. You speed up the process of closing, gain a reputation for someone in the business with pull, and the holy grail of a successful sale, recommendations to family, friends, and coworkers currently in the market. Help resolve obstacles. It is possible that the inspector's report or appraisal points out additional issues with the house, such as electrical problems, a crack in the foundation, or any of a myriad of issues that could turn into an expensive ordeal down the line. Part of your job is to calmly advise your client on how to proceed. Then you can act as a buffer between your buyer and the seller or seller's agent. This often keeps discussions on a professional level so that problems can be resolved instead of becoming tense and heated. For example, the inspection is completed and the inspector has turned up several minor issues. Your buyers, Debbie and Simone Wassler, are immediately up in arms about the length of the list and want to rescind the offer. You look over the list a few times to ensure that your initial assessment is correct. Sure enough, all the items are minor, and though there are 12 on the list, some will take a few dollars, such as replacing a washer in a leaky faucet, while others are slightly bigger ticket items, such as light fixtures that are not up to code and need to be replaced. You don't see anything that would cost more than a few $100s, and some would not need to be undertaken in the near future. You call up the Wasslers and give them your opinion on each item and what it would cost. Then, you call the seller's agent to see if the sellers are willing to help with the essential repair. The sellers agree to take 30% of the repairs off the list price. Crisis averted. Customer versus client. There is a significant difference between a client and a customer in terms of the duties of real estate agents and their brokers. The following definitions apply from the perspective of the buyer and assumes that you are representing the buyer in the transaction. Client. A client has a legal and binding relationship with the realtor or broker. There is a signed agreement called a buyer representation agreement that governs the relationship when a buyer's agent works to obtain a property listed by another agent on behalf of the client. Conversely, the listing agreement for sellers documents the relationship when an agent lists a property for sale. Customer. A customer in a real estate transaction normally has an agent that represents them. If you are the buyer's agent, then your client, the buyer, is a customer of the seller's broker. However, there is a difference between being a client versus being a customer. The law specifies some rights owed to a customer in a transaction, but since the relationship is not formal, they are very different than the agency owed to a client who has signed an agreement to hire you. To recap, the client, or principal, hires a broker to represent them as an agent. The prospective buyer is the customer of the seller's broker. What is the difference between a buyer's agent and a listing agent? As the buyer's agent, you are legally bound to help the buyer. Obviously, if you are the listing agent, you represent the seller. For example, your buyer, Namita Mupidi, goes to an open house and gushes to the seller's agent about how much they love the house and need to buy soon. Namita is expecting the family's second child, and the lease on their tiny apartment is running out. The ebullient mother-to-be divulges all this to the seller's agent, who is the last person she should be telling this information. It is likely that the seller's agent wishes her luck and will tell her seller not to budge on the price. They have a buyer on hand whose clock is ticking. 2 weeks later, when you aren't able to get a concession on the asking price, Namita tearfully relays the conversation and wonders how the selling agent could be so cruel. You explain to her that the other agent was just looking out for her client's best interest, and that she needed to understand the difference between being a client and being a customer. Let's review some key words before discussing the fiduciary responsibility of a buyer's agent to his principal or client. Agency law. Agency law occurs when one person hires another to represent them for a lawful transaction involving a third person, the customer. When an agent begins working with a buyer or seller, they are designated as the buyer's or seller's agent, respectively. Agency implies a fiduciary responsibility. A fiduciary can speak for the client in real estate transactions. A licensee is a fiduciary. The principal is the person represented by an agent. They are also called the client. This is usually who pays the realtor for their services. Fiduciary duties owed to customer. The seller's agent owes certain duties to the buyer as a customer. These are limited to full disclosure of material facts, honesty, reasonable skill and care. Honesty. An agent's duty of disclosure in the agent-principal relationship is not the same as a real estate broker's duty to disclose or tell customers about known material facts. Disclosing known defects is part of a broker's duty to treat all parties in a transaction honestly. In other words, the duty of honesty is independent of any agency relationship that may or may not exist between the realtor or broker and anyone impacted by the transaction. What is a material defect? Any fact that may have a significant and reasonable impact on the market value of the property is material. Full disclosure of material facts. A failure to disclose is one of the major reasons people go to court over real estate-related transactions. Known defects have to be disclosed before the closing occurs on a property. it is the responsibility of the owner to make such disclosures to the buyer. Examples of material defects include cracks in the foundation, termites, or perhaps a leaky roof. Other types of defects are environmental hazards and zoning. For example, while you are conducting a walkthrough of a condo with your buyer, the owner, Jeff Fox, pulls you aside and mentions that there is a leak in the bathroom from the upstairs unit. The owner of the upstairs unit has refused to fix the issue, and the condo association won't get involved. Jeff asks that you keep this to yourself since he cannot remedy the situation, and that he will make it worth your while. You thank Jeff for his candor and finish the tour quickly. This is not a situation that you put your buyer into. Leaky pipes, bad neighbors, and an ineffective HOA. Of course, since you are acting in a fiduciary role for the buyer, you tell him about Jeff's comments and apologize for wasting his time. Duty of a seller. A seller can be held responsible for damage if he does not make them known before a closing. No known material defects can be concealed from the buyer. For example, during the inspection, it turns out that the refrigerator and stove are both not working. The sale specifies that all appliances in the home are included and in working order. The owners agree to replace the appliances since they don't want to issue a credit that would reduce the sales price. When your buyers move in, the appliances have not been replaced. Luckily, the owners don't want to end up in court and provide funds for the buyers to replace the appliances. In this case, the owners had known about a material defect, had agreed to resolve it, and then violated the terms of the contract. Unfortunately, these cases come up more times than you would think, so it is important to make sure that you follow through on every step of the way. In this case, you would have strongly advised your clients to pay for an inspection to catch any major issues with the property. Otherwise, they would have been out the money to replace the faulty appliances. Duty of the buyer. In order to hold a seller responsible for failure to disclose, the prospective buyer has to exercise due diligence by hiring a contractor to inspect the property. If defects are found after the preliminary inspection, the buyer cannot sue for material defects at a later date. Duty of a broker. A broker has obligations of disclosure too. They must disclose any material defects to the buyer, as well as any limitation that could impact the seller's ability to complete the sale. However, the broker has no duty to inspect the property or financial standing of the seller, since they do not have expertise in the fields needed to do so. Reasonable care and diligence. An agent is committed to exercising reasonable care and diligence while representing the principal's best interest. The standard of care required is that of a competent real estate professional. By holding a license, a broker is assumed to have expertise exceeding that of a normal person. Your responsibility as an agent is to apply your skill and knowledge to further the interest of your client, the principal. You cannot be held responsible for an expertise outside your field, such as engineering, law, or other professionals sometimes required to complete real estate transactions. Finally, As an exclusive buyer's agent, you must prepare yourself through study to gain the knowledge to represent the buyer with utmost competence and care in every aspect of the transaction. Negotiating compensation for locating a property. Once a property is obtained and the offer is accepted by the seller, the buyer's broker receives compensation for acting as the client's agent. This compensation can be a flat fee or a percentage of the sales price. It is important to remember that commission is always negotiable, but you should have nailed down the percentage before beginning to look for properties for the client. In return for this commission, you will schedule appointments to see homes and adjust the search criteria as the client solidifies the type of property that will work for them. Sometimes it can take weeks or months to find the perfect fit. So the more information you find out up front, the quicker the process will be completed. Fiduciary responsibilities owed as buyer's broker. As the buyer's agent, you have the same fiduciary duties to your client as the seller's broker has to the seller. These include obedience, loyalty, disclosure, confidentiality, accounting, reasonable skill, and care. Here is a closer look at the responsibilities an exclusive buyer's agent owes to the principal. Disclosure was discussed in detail in an earlier segment. Obedience. You must obey instructions from the buyer regarding the real estate transaction. For example, your client falls in love with a vacation home that is priced $20,000 over market price. Your client lives overseas and wants to close as soon as possible. They are paying cash, so financing is not an issue. After advising them of the market value and the unlikelihood on getting back their original investment upon resale, your job is to follow your client's instructions and make an offer at the exorbitant asking price. Your client tells you privately that they spend thousands on hotels whenever they come to the area for business, and so to them, the investment pays off in the end. Conversely, if your client wishes to make a ridiculously low offer on a home, after advising them against it, if they still wish to pursue it, you must present the low offer to the seller's agent. Loyalty. You are obligated to do anything you can to lawfully win an advantage for your buyer. For example, your client asks you to falsify a pre-approval letter from a bank so that their offer will be accepted while they are securing funding. You regretfully inform them that this is illegal and could result in you losing your license or going to jail. You caution them against that course of action, and they come back a week later with an authentic pre-approval letter for a reliable mortgage institution. You are still acting within the scope of agency for loyalty and obedience, which exclude carrying out illegal actions. Confidentiality. As part of the agency relationship, you have to keep everything that the buyer discloses to you confidential. This includes information that may impact the buyer's capability or motivation to pay more than the asking price. For example, a buyer has been pre-approved for $250,000, but part of the money they have on hand is a temporary loan from their parents that they are hoping will become a gift. If the parents don't come through on the gift, they will be unable to go through with the deal. Despite being upset at a falsehood that can impact your livelihood and reputation, you are prohibited from sharing this information because it would be harmful to your buyer's interest and result in a breach of fiduciary duty of confidentiality to your client. Reasonable care. You are required to prepare through education and ongoing study to achieve and maintain your expertise in the industry in order to be able to competently represent the buyer. Accounting. The buyer's broker is obligated to account any money or documents given to them. For example, you are a broker representing buyers of real property. Prior to the sale, you collect $300 for an inspection of the property. You are legally required to keep this money in a separate account set aside for the transaction. You cannot commingle this money with any personal or business accounts unrelated to the sale. To do so would be a breach of the fiduciary duty of accounting that you owe to the buyer, your client. It is highly advisable to accept and hold monies of any kind for as short a time as possible. Types of buyer agreements. A buyer agency agreement defines the type of agency implied by a signed contract. The basics. The most common type of agency is exclusive right-to-sell agency, in which the buyer's broker receives commission if a property is found for the buyer. It doesn't matter if the buyer or another realtor found the property. The broker is still compensated per the agreement. In exclusive buyer agency, you only receive commission if you find a property the buyer purchases. In non-exclusive buyer agency, any broker can look for properties for the buyer. Whichever agent finds the property receives a commission. Most realtors avoid this type of contract since there is no protection that your time and energy won't be wasted. Buyer representation agreement. To prevent misunderstandings, you and the buyer sign a contract defining your agency relationship. Within the contract, both parties will have specified duties. There are three main types of buyer agency contracts: non-exclusive not-for-compensation contracts, non-exclusive right-to-represent contracts, and exclusive right-to-represent contracts. Let's start with the non-exclusive not-for-compensation contracts. This contract specifies commission is not due to the broker. The buyer can retain multiple brokers and revoke the contract at any time. If the broker does find a suitable home, commission is paid at that time. For example, you find a buyer for a single-family, 3-bedroom, 2-bath home in the Harrisburg area. When you present a contract to the owner, they call your clients up and make a side deal. You try to get them to pay your commission, knowing that your clients had never met the owners before. Since you are the only one with anything to gain, no one backs you. With no contract, you have no recourse to fight for the commission you have earned. This is the least desirable type of contract, and most realtors avoid it altogether. Non-exclusive right-to-represent contracts. This contract provides the terms of compensation due if the broker finds a suitable home for the buyer. The buyer may obtain a home on their own or through another broker. This agreement can only be prematurely canceled under specified conditions. Exclusive right to represent contracts. This is the most common buyer's broker contract. This agreement defines broker-agent relationship, which includes the obligations of the buyer and the broker. The buyer cannot retain another broker for the duration of the contract. The broker is due a commission even if the buyer or another broker finds the house the buyer purchases. Non-exclusive contracts usually are good for 1 to 2 months. Exclusive agreements are generally several months to 1 year and cannot be terminated except under specified conditions. For example, you sign an exclusive right to represent contract with Pearl and Forrest Kennedy. A week later, you have an offer to present them, but Forrest says that they already found a buyer and no longer need your services. You remind them about the contract they signed and that they have to pay your commission either way. It turns out they accepted a much lower offer from buyers that did not even have a pre-approval for financing. Your prospect is a cash buyer, highly motivated to close quickly. Thankfully, you are a masterful negotiator, and the Kennedys go with your offer, thus avoiding a court case with the incumbent expenses. You should now have a good understanding of the legal duties and common practices that surround your fiduciary duty to a buyer who you are representing in a transaction involving the transfer of real property. You are now one step closer to your career as a successful realtor, well versed in the duties and responsibilities owed to a client versus a customer.